Welcome everyone to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis. I am the Director of Development here at CTC Software, and today we're kicking off a fun new series. This is going to be the Nexus CMS Admin Learning Series. We're going to go from beginning to the end, talking about absolutely everything, and we're focusing first on the core settings. All of the settings that relate to the Nexus CMS that you can control from an organizational level, or at least a default level, and what they mean. So that's what we're going through in today's session. Now, as always, these webinars are recorded. So if you miss a webinar in this series live and you want to go back and review it on the YouTubes, go for it. It will be up there within a couple hours of the recording. For those of you who are joining us live, we always try to answer questions live while we're going through, especially if it's relevant to what we're talking about at the moment when we see the question. So for those of you joining us live, use that questions window and go to webinar. I do keep an eye on that window, and I will try to answer the questions that relate to today's topic live. We also save a huge QA session for the end that never makes its way into the recording. So kind of a bonus for you to be here in our live webinars. Without further ado, let's jump right in and take a look at today's settings. So as a Nexus admin, as any admin, really, you need to know how to configure the settings for the thing you're administering. In today's example, we're talking about Nexus, and we're focusing on the CMS. And so you need to be able to configure the CMS aspect to work for your entire team. Having these settings set up kind of not really in the most optimal ways can mean that your designers really and your team members don't really get the best experience within the CMS when they're trying to use it. Now, we feel that our defaults are pretty good, but honestly, that's not always the case, right? The reason why we have settings is because people have different opinions and ways of using the content. So you may want to modify these settings, and to do so, you're going to want to understand what they can do. So here in today's session, I'm going to be really going deep, talking about every Nexus CMS setting that you can control from an organizational level. We're going to go through what it means and talk a bit, in a lot of cases, about how it can affect your team as a whole. This is not meant to be a really quick, 10,000-foot view. We're going to dig deep. We're going to go into everything here. So we're going to go through a few critical things. Now, if you're brand new to Nexus, right, this might feel a bit overwhelming, a bit overloading, but we're going to start right from the beginning and go through everything start to finish. First off, today, how do we even get to the CMS settings control panel? Like, where are we going? We're going to take a look at things right up front that would be default user settings for when new users are added to your organization. Now, existing users, they're not affected by this, but new users, as you add new people or new people sign on with single sign-on, they would get these default settings. And so it's important to get these configured as soon as possible. We're also going to take a look, of course, at organization-wide settings that affect the CMS. And we're going to configure and save a number of these settings so that we have good, settings for the organization as a whole. And then all future sessions, when you open up the Nexus CMS and begin to use it, that will be affected by these settings. So first things first, how do we even get to the control panel that controls this? Is this in the desktop app? Is this in the web app? Like, where is this happening? Well, I'm going to show you. This actually does happen from the portal. And so I'm going to be here on ctcsoftware.com. This is our primary website at the moment, ctcsoftware.com. And I encourage you as admins to follow along with me. You can take a look at these settings right alongside when you get signed in. So here, I'm going to go ahead and just log in. A little person over here, you can log in right at this point. You can also get to this another way. If you go into products, you can go to sign in for Nexus. It's the same thing. Both bring you to the exact same place. It doesn't matter. I personally got used to just hitting the little person over here, hitting the login button if you can get to it, or just hit the person. It's the same thing as well. And then you can log in securely. Now, if you don't yet have a Nexus account and you're just like legit starting, you're probably going to want to go to Get Started with Nexus, and that way it'll help guide you through the account creation process and get you a trial. But for those of you who own it, directly sign in, or once you're on this page, log in securely. So I'm going to put in my credentials, and I'm going to be using my CTC Express Tools account here that I use for customer-facing demos, so you can see exactly the settings that you'll have available to you. I'm going to go ahead and continue on this, put in my password here, if I can remember it. assuming I get this right the first time. That would be a miracle, right? Because I can't type when I'm on a recording. That's just the rules. All right, we're in the portal. So in the portal, the whole goal here is to figure out how to navigate to where these settings exist. Where I'm going to go is right here at the top, CMS. In the CMS subtab here, or this area within the portal, I'm going to go to settings right here at the bottom. And there's two areas for settings. There's user settings and there's organization settings. And so we're going to start by talking about establishing user default settings. So to that end, in the portal here, we're going to start at the very bottom of this stack, kind of the foundational control area here, and I'm going to go into user. So in the user space right here, I'm going to show you something in the actual Nexus product, which I did not have open, so we're going to give this thing a second to open up. These settings that you have here on the user settings tab are actually represented on your account right now within the CMS. So if you want to change how your settings are, your personal user settings, you can do this within the CMS itself. But this page here, this user settings, is for default settings for new users. If I go up into my login up here and go into user settings, it's effectively the same thing that shows up here. Now, because I'm already an active user, my settings have values and I can control and configure those however I want. So the log frequency, for example, this option right here, mine is set to verbose. I've changed mine this way and I set it so that all new users, when they sign in, brand new users, they also get the verbose option. So in the portal here, these settings again are for new users. I can't stress that enough. I get a lot of people who are like, well, how do I change it for all users? Once they're made, they have whatever the defaults were, and they get to make their own choices. You don't get to reset their settings from this environment here. So they get to change their settings after it exists for them. So number of items to display per page, for example, things like whether or not type selectors or view selectors should be displayed, right? The default sort option, items like that, right? So there's some default values here. And so I'm just going to cancel out of this and go back to the portal. And these are the defaults that you can affect before the user signs on, the first time, before the user account is created. So log frequency. These settings here in Nexus, you can get some logs if something goes sideways for whatever reason. Content doesn't load or doesn't process up, or the Nexus CMS for some reason is causing some issues and for whatever reason it's crashing. I don't know. It doesn't connect to AutoCAD. I don't know. Whatever the reason for the issues are, that information will be logged because the app keeps information in a logs folder underneath the username local. And so you can decide how much information is actually logged. Is it just the errors? Is it errors and warnings only? Or is it a really verbose log that tells you everything that's happening? Now, personally, I like the verbose because sometimes when something goes a little screwy, it's not an error or a warning. It's just something weird happened. And I'd like to know what it was. So the verbose logging helps me get as much information as I possibly can. So personal preference, I like this. Maybe you don't care, you can change this to whatever you want. Now those logs do get cleaned up after a certain amount of time, but you can choose what actually is being logged. Now there's an option here to turn off within the Nexus CMS specifically the notifications when Nexus updates become available. Quite common, we install a product and then CTC, eventually we are going to release an update because we're constantly improving upon these tools. When those updates come out, do you want all users by default to be notified when they open up the CMS, there's a new version available? Well, this used to be a really good thing, but I think it's no longer quite as relevant now that CTC has recently launched the CTC Access tool, which is sort of a system tray tool that allows you to get notifications. So you don't really need the notification in-app. So personally, I have this turned off, completely turned off. And I'll show you another spot where we can turn it off as well. So then the next one down here is display type selector dialog when specifically loading a Revit family. So the type selector when loading a Revit family is, say you load a door, say you load an air terminal, Say you load, I don't know, a Herman Miller chair, whatever. A lot of the times in our Revit families, there are types, multiple types. And if you have in Revit natively a type catalog, Revit will pop a little window up to say, whoa, which types do you want to load? You can be selective. In Revit natively, if you don't have a type catalog, it just loads the family with all of the types that are in the family. Well, the Nexus CMS has the ability to display the type selector whether or not there is a type catalog. So all of your families basically can act like they have a type catalog. If you turn this on, you check this box, then by default, when a user is about to load a family, it'll go, oh, there's multiple types. And it displays the type selector dialog, similar to what Revit would do. And then they can be selective. Again, whether or not there is a type catalog, it can do this. If you turn this off by default, then it will just load the entirety of the family. Whether there's a type catalog or not, it will always load every type into your project. Now, personally, I like this being turned on. Some people don't, and they might turn it off, but this is a user controllable setting. And back here in the CMS, once again, if for whatever reason a user does turn that off, they can always come back here and recheck that back on to get the type selector to show up if they unintentionally disable that, right? Similarly here, there is a view selector, and this actually should say when loading Revit sheets, because this is a sheets thing. But when you're loading in Revit sheets that have typical details on them, you can be selective if this is checked, and you can load the discrete drafting views that are on the sheet instead of loading the entire sheet, kind of like having types for a family. Some people love this, some people don't love this. I personally typically will load the entire sheet when I'm loading it, so I usually have this turned off for myself, but I leave it turned on by default for end users because they might like this functionality. And since this is recent functionality, you might not have even known this was a possibility, but you can have like really involved detail sheets, and when a user grabs it, they could then use that as a jumping off path to just load the discrete details, like collections of details. So it's an option. Within the Nexus CMS, there are different ways of sorting your content. And again, this is a user option. This is not an org-wide setting. So you can sort by relevance, which is the typical default. So the more relevant your content or the content that's discovered is that relates to your search criteria and your filters, the higher to the top of the list it will float. And some people really love this. Now, I've been getting myself used to sorting by name recently. That just means that it's alphabetizing the content by file name, family name, if you're in Revit, or block name if you're in AutoCAD. But it sorts by name, which means even if something is incredibly relevant to your search, it will show in the list alphabetically when you do it this way. You may also choose to sort by rating or when it was added, when it was updated. These three tend to be more sort of manager level kind of sorting options. But for end users, you probably want to pick either relevance or name by default. So when they go into the app, it will sort that way by default. And again, users can change this themselves if they want to. So users who have existed for a while probably will have the default sort by set to relevance. They may have chosen to change it to by name. That's on them. They can make that choice. But what this effectively does is in the CMS, when you go to search and you clear out your search filtration over here, it will reset the sort by to whatever that default option is. So you can control this in the moment, but when you clear out, it will go back to whatever that setting in user settings is set to. The default sort by when settings are cleared or when you first open up, it will be set to whatever this option is. So you can choose for end users what that default functionality feels like. Next option here, number of items to display per page. I think the default when you first get into this environment as a manager will be probably 25 is the default. 25 feels a bit too few for me. So I personally changed the default to 100. That's the maximum that this can be. And what that basically does is when you run a search, like I just did, this says that there are 100 items loaded out of available 13,000 approximately items that were found. So it loads 100 at a time. And so if I'm scrolling down, eventually when I get to the bottom of the page here, as I'm scrolling, you see the little thinky bar shows up on top up here, and it's going to basically fetch the next 100. Now there's 200 loaded. Well, I do this in chunks of 100, and I basically teach my users that, hey, if you're scrolling beyond 2 or 3 pages, you need to refine your search a bit, because you shouldn't be doom scrolling here. Save that for Facebook or Instagram, right? You can doom scroll there all you want, but don't be doom scrolling in the Nexus, because every time you scroll, like, you should be finding your content that you're searching for pretty close to the top. Otherwise, you should be refining your search. There's no reason to scroll through 13,000 elements here. It just doesn't make sense. Not really. So, put in some kind of a search criteria. Hey, I'm looking for chairs or something, right? Like whatever, and then like it's going to start to give you fewer results. This is still too many items here. 1,100 items is, in my opinion, still too much, but at least it's fewer than 13,000, right? So the whole point, though, is that they should be refining this by using some filtration, by using some better search terms, whatever that case might be. But this just determines how many default items per page, right? When they first kick off, again, brand new users. And then you can also set the default preview image size in pixels. This setting will probably be going away eventually. It's not really that critical to set this. All that does within the CMS is it kind of adjusts where this sets by default. The minimum is like, I think, 50, and the maximum is like, I think, 150. So any place inside that range, you can kind of control it, whatever you want that to be. But users are going to be adjusting this depending on where they want. If you go take a look at the Nexus CMS user learning series, we talk about controlling this depending on what sort of view style you're leveraging. I often adjust this depending on what my current circumstances call for. So each user is going to have their own preference. It doesn't really matter what you set this to. It's going to get adjusted. So this one is whatever. Ultimately, at the end, though, once you've gone through your user settings, click Save. And now every future user that gets added into your portal, either by them trying to sign up and you accepting them, or you discreetly adding them through users and groups, or however you decide to get users added in, from this point forward, these will be their defaults for all of those new users. Okay, let's go take a look at the next setting here, the organization-wide settings. This is the next area that we're going to focus on. And this is the bigger area, but these settings truly are organization-wide. They affect everybody on your team 100% of the time until you change them. But then that new setting affects everybody on your team. So you might have seen me just click over here in the CMS kind of main navigation tab. Underneath settings, I went to the organization settings. These organization settings here, these do affect everybody, and it's pretty much instantaneous. You make changes right now, it's going to affect how things happen from this point forward into the future. So these settings are also very important, and I recommend for many of these that you get them figured out as soon as it makes sense. Some of these control how your content gets processed in and what the Nexus CMS does by default with that content. Some of this controls how end users interact with the content. We're going to go through all that right now and talk about what each of these settings mean. So we talked in the user level of letting a user be notified if a software update is available. Well, you have the ability also to turn off org-wide, basically for everybody, to not be notified when a software update is available. And I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's not really everybody. You, the admins who are in here doing work on this area, you're going to be notified no matter what, right? You're going to be notified. But this is like, allow any user who has that checkbox turned on to be notified. Well, you could check this on, and then anybody who has it enabled, when there's an update, they will be notified when they open up the CMS. You might want to just hard stop that. And like I said, with the new CTC Access tool, this setting is likely no longer really all that relevant, because the CTC Access tool is where those notifications are probably going to be the most relevant for you. So that's why I have mine turned off. I don't want to see it in the CMS. I don't want my users to see it in the CMS. It's kind of a distraction sometimes when you're opening it up. In the past, that was kind of the only way to be notified, but now with the Access tool, you don't really need this. And so this legacy setting will likely be retired in the future. Just to the right of that, there is the ability to enable content requests. There's a checkbox here to enable or disable it. Now, if you disable it, you'll notice that the whole UI changes a bit because this requests URL line goes away. What does this do? Well, what this enable content requests does, if it's checked within the CMS, the add request option will appear over here on the left-hand side. The button will exist if that box is checked. Now, when the button is clicked, when they actually try to add a request, the next little line here, if this is checked, can help control that. If you leave this blank, what it does is it targets the CTC requests page. So then it'll bring them to our request page in this portal. If you put in your own internal support system, maybe you're using Zendesk in-house, maybe you have some other kind of IT request ticketing system and you want to redirect the users to that, whatever that URL is to that program, to that web page, that internal ticketing system, you can put that here. And when you save this, then when a user goes and clicks add request, it directs them to your ticketing system instead of the request system here inside the Nexus space. So if you have one, some of my customers have a pretty involved ticketing system. Great. You can redirect users to that. You can leverage this button. But if you don't have that, totally fine. Leverage the one that's built into Nexus, and you can leverage this to manage your requests. Now, we'll have a future session talking about administering requests, but for now, just know that you can direct where this goes. And if you have it enabled, the button will exist in the CMS. And if this is blank, it goes to here, to this area. Okay. Below that, we have a couple of other columns of things. We're going to start here with first with the cache and log settings. So with content that you open out of Nexus, the CMS part of Nexus, when you use that content, when I go grab something, I double click on a window to load it, or I double click on a block to insert it into a drawing, or whatever that might be. And give me 1 second. I'm going to change my user settings to not have a hover preview for right now. I changed it for another presentation earlier, and now I don't want it. When I load something, when I grab a Word document to do something with it, whatever you're doing, it's going to be, if this is a cloud cached piece of content, it's going to be cached someplace locally so your computer can use it. Because our computers and Revit and AutoCAD, for that matter, doesn't have the ability to easily load from the web. It has to cache locally first. It has to be on the local system. And so the cache location by default is specified here. It goes to App Data, CTC, CMS, Content Cache. And you can change where this goes by default. So if you don't want it to go here, maybe you want it to go to CApp Data Nexus, I don't know, you can do whatever you want. You can change this folder. And when you change that, if the folder does not exist, then the Nexus CMS, the next time it's launched, will go, oh, I need to make that folder. And then as users are loading content, it caches to that location. Now, of course, as users leverage the Nexus CMS over multiple years, this folder could potentially get really big because they're going to be using content after content after content. If it's constantly caching and never cleaning up after itself, that could be a bad day. So just to the right of that, there's this auto delete after function. And if this is checked, then it will clean up after that cache. Every 30 days or all the time, it basically checks to see, is this content stale? Has it not been used within the past 30 days? And if that's the case, then it will delete that content. So you've basically got a 30-day rolling cache of used content that the user can very quickly access for things that are regularly accessed, and for stuff that's kind of gone stale and hasn't been used for a while, well, it just deletes it. And that way it's nice, neat, and clean. If you want to take a look at how this is structured, you can go for that. Just grab this path and drop it into Windows Explorer. You can go look at what you've got in your cache. And depending on your settings, you might have this set to 15 days. You might have it set to 45 days. That's up to you, because this auto delete after is the number of days it holds on to content right here. So you can control that. Just below that, similar to the cache, we've got those log files. Now, we were talking about where the log files, how verbose are they on the user settings here. But when there are logs, if there are errors, there will be logs no matter what. That goes to a specific folder as well. In this case, users, app data, CTC software, CMS logs. And I think for some reason I changed my paths to not be the same path for some reason at some time. So mine's a little different here for the org. But once again, this folder path, you can go there if you want to and see what you have for log data. And once again, you can auto delete these after a certain amount of time. And once again, it's based on the number of days. So you have full control about cache and log files right here, where they go and how long they're kept. So that's a nice little setting. And again, this is organization-wide. So you can change the setting, save these settings, and then in the future, as the next time the CMS opens, it will do whatever cleanup it needs to do or not, depending on what the new settings are that you put here. Keep in mind, if you do change the folder for something, then it won't go to the old cache location and clean that up anymore. It'll just stagnate. So just keep that in mind. You might want to run some kind of admin script to go delete the old folder if you do redirect this to some other place on your computer system. Okay, scrolling down, there's two other columns of information here to take a look at. The first one I'm going to take a look at is left side, library settings. So there's a few settings inside of here, and sometimes when we've got settings, some of them are sort of nested settings, and we'll see that here in a minute. The first library setting for you admins to understand is, can other admins share your content with other organizations externally from your company? Do you want to allow that in the first place, to allow sharing invitations to outside people? If you do, or you think you might need that, leave this checked. If you're like, nah, I never ever want to share stuff outside my firm, you could uncheck this. And then in the Manage Libraries area, you would not be able to actually invite users from other firms to partner with you on your content. So this is an option that you can choose to enable or disable. Now, if you are sharing content with outside organizations, it is recommended that you have your content cloud cached in the CMS so that those outside organizations can actually use it. And we'll take a look at that in a minute here, but for these sharing invitations in the first place, do you want to allow it? That's up to you. There's also a checkbox here to show public libraries from other organizations. So if somebody else makes content, quote, public, you can choose to enable seeing that or completely disable that from your end users. Now, part of today's discussion in this session is to show you where that would affect your end user experience, right? So this here, show public, if I go back into the CMS, if you expand out libraries, you probably default to my libraries, my personal libraries. If this is unchecked, it's going to default then to public libraries. If I uncheck this, it goes back. You're seeing one or the other. Or you could, if you wanted to, see both my libraries, my private libraries, and public libraries at the same time. Like, well, Sean, what is this public libraries thing? Well, this is sort of a marketplace of content where, like, the out-of-the-box Autodesk content exists here in these public libraries. There's other manufacturers who have content that is available in these public libraries that your users can search. If, for whatever reason, you're like, I don't ever want to see public libraries, I don't want my users to see it, you do have the option to turn that off. But if you want them to use out-of-the-box stuff or have access to other manufacturer stuff, then you might want to show it. It's not the default, by the way, y'all. It's not going to always like be in their face. They have to kind of make a choice to go get public library content, but just the ability to go find that in the first place. Now, if you uncheck this, they don't get the checkbox for public. They only ever will see your private libraries. If you check this, then they see your private libraries by default, but public as an option, and then they can go include that if they want to. There's another checkbox here just below that lets you set up the default filtration kind of in the filters. This is kind of beyond just library settings, but the automatic filter for the active design app version. This primarily affects Revit users. If this is checked, when you're in the CMS, the version over here will default to whatever your active Revit design app version is. Now, in my case, I have no active Revit session running right now that's connected to the CMS, so it wouldn't be filtering anyway. But say I had Revit 2023 open and active, and this checkbox was checked, it would default to, when I clear settings, running the search based on Revit version 23 and only returning Revit content that relates to Revit version 23. So you can choose to enable this. Now there's another feature in this portal that I recommend you consider if you're going to enable this. I'm going to recommend, if you turn this on, that you also have, where is it at here, automatic upgrades for Revit content enabled. This makes your management way more simple because you can upload an old version of content and it will always auto upgrade, and then this auto filter becomes a little bit more relevant. If you don't have the enable automatic upgrades enabled, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute, then this sometimes can be problematic. If you didn't process content, say, explicitly for Revit 2024, when a user goes to search and that explicit version filter is set, they won't find any content from 20 through 23, or obviously 25 because you can't use it anyway, but you wouldn't find some of that other content. So this one here is an option that you can use. That's why it's in organization settings, right? It's an optional setting. But by default, most people tend to have this turned off unless you guarantee you're going to have content in specific version years all the time, in all current version years. So if you do have this checked, you'll notice this sub option here sort of ungrays out. If this is checked, you can also automatically update search results to match the current design app. Now, what that means is if I had Revit, say, 23 and Revit 24 open at the same time, and I'm switching back and forth between them, what'll happen is whatever my search criteria is, when I switch between those two apps, it'll automatically target that app and apply those search results for the end user. And then if I switch back to 23, it would automatically go back to 23 and apply those search results for that user, right? So then as they're switching back and forth, they're always getting that specific Revit version when they're switching around into different design apps. So some people like this as well. But once again, it's most relevant if you have content for all Revit version years in that case, and probably that would be done because you've enabled automatic upgrades. If you don't have this, though, you probably don't want this. But it's an option. Try it out for yourself. See how you like it. Now, relating to this allow sharing invitations to other organizations, if you're enabling this, you may want to make sure they are aware they've been invited to an external organization. And so you can send an email to that external user when they are invited to join one of your libraries. If you are not allowing this, then this doesn't matter. If you are using this, maybe you don't want to send an email, but you want to have your team personally call them to let them know. So this way it wouldn't send an email notification to them. You would have to say, hey, we've just invited you. You can now use this. And that way, maybe you don't want to be blasting a bunch of people. If you're inviting, say, 30, 40 people, maybe you don't want to be blasting them all with emails, and you just want to do a team meeting together and let them all know, hey, you've all been given access. Then maybe you don't send an email notification when that external user is invited to join one of your libraries. So that's up to you to kind of decide how that notification engine works for you at your company. Okay, let's jump over here to the next column, the content settings column. We're almost done with this little discussion. Again, we're digging deep into all these settings and talking about what everything means in detail here. So underneath content settings, within the libraries area, you can set users. Let's just go here and take a look. We're going to dig deep into these settings here in one of our next sessions. And I think we've already got a pre-recorded one on our YouTube channel right now. In the permissions area, there's 3 different tiers of permissioning. And one of those tiers is a contributor level tier. You get to control what a contributor can actually do. Like, what does that actually mean? In the organization area here, content settings, there's an option here for allow contributor to basically leave comments and ratings. Do you want that contributor level user to have the ability to rate and comment on content? If they're assigned to a contributor of a discrete library, then if this box is checked, they could comment and rate the stuff in that folder. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to if you unchecked it. Now, a consumer of content wouldn't have that ability anyway. A manager tier user will have that ability no matter what you check here. This specifically relates to contributor assigned users. Just similar, right below that, another thing you can control about contributors is, do you want those contributors to be able to assign and or remove tagging from content in the library when they've got that contributor level right? Yes or no? Well, you can just check or uncheck this. So if you want them, say, to only be able to rate and comment on content, then you'd set it up like this. If you want them to only be able to tag content, like mess with the tagging application and not comment and rate, then check it like this. If you want them to have none of that, then don't do this, make them a consumer, because these two checkboxes are basically what a contributor gets as extra rights. Now, if you want both, commenting and rating and the ability to work with tags, great. Set it up like this, right? So both checked, one checked. Typically I wouldn't do both unchecked. That would be kind of silly to make somebody a contributor in the first place. Like I said, just make them a consumer at that level. And we're going to talk again way more deeply about managing libraries in another session here. There's a checkbox here to allow cloud content caching. Now remember, I was mentioning over here, allow for invitations to outside organizations. If you do this, if you invite people from outside organizations and they try to get the content that's in a library you've invited them to, but your content is not cloud cached, then the problem would be they can't actually get access to the source content if it's not available someplace in the cloud. So they would have to be VPN'd into your network, which typically you wouldn't want an external user to do in most cases. So if you're going to be enabling this, you probably want your content to be cloud cached, at least by default. Now, there's still quite a bit of discretion at the library level where you can take a discrete library and tell it not to be cloud cached. But by default, allow cloud content caching has that turned on by default. And then any content processed into libraries where that is enabled will be cloud cached when you're processing that in. And we're going to talk way more about content processing in the future, but know that this setting right here kind of controls organization-wide whether or not your content that you are processing in the CMS can be additionally cached in the Nexus CMS cloud. You can also, right below that, control when content is cloud cached. And in fact, if I uncheck this, notice how these other two checkboxes are sort of dependent upon this option here. But right below that, if my content is cloud cached, then it's going to prefer the cloud content with this checkbox checked. That means that when a user double clicks on a piece of content, the Nexus CMS is going to try to go look for that cloud content first and cache that to the user's machine. Otherwise, if you uncheck this, then it's going to always look to your local system and try and find it on whatever that local path is. And if it can't find it there, then it'll try to go to the cloud second. I prefer going to cloud first because that tends to be way faster, especially for Revit system-hosted content, system family content like wall types or duct types, typical details, schedules, things like that. It is way faster to leverage the Nexus cloud over just your local content. So I prefer that. A lot of us prefer to disallow users from being able to right-click a piece of content, like right-click here, and use the download option. I don't typically want users to be creating content silos. So I typically disable that right-click download functionality, and you can do that right from here. So for your libraries that you own, your private libraries, the download feature would be disallowed for any content that exists in those libraries if you have it set up like this. There's another checkbox here, allow clear content. Okay, remember that cache location up here? Every once in a great while, there's a reason why I might want to just wipe it clean and start afresh. Do I want to allow users to have an easy ability to clear that content? If this is unchecked, let me go back into user settings here. There is a checkbox or an option here to clear the cache. If I uncheck that option in the portal and save that, then when a user goes into these settings, they would not have the clear cache. Okay, so that's what this does, allow clear content cache. Now they would still be able to browse to that location, that button that's in the user settings here. Go back in there. That says open cache folder. will basically open this folder on their computer. They can still open that, and they could still choose to delete the content that exists inside of there. It just isn't a shortcut. There's more steps to it. So if you wanted to disable that, you could. Now, notice this. Clearing the cache, if I have that button enabled, it tells me clearing the cache will free up about 2,000 meg, almost 2 gig of file space on my computer. So again, sometimes there's a darn good reason why I might want to clear that up. I use a lot of random files while I'm doing demonstrations personally, so I get a lot of trash here. But if users are targeting specific content regularly, they're probably going to have whatever that cache is probably a really good cache for them. And so it probably makes sense for them to keep it. But sometimes, like I said, clearing it out is not a bad thing. So they have that option to just straight up clear it out. Now keep in mind, the Nexus CMS is going to automatically delete anything that hasn't been used within the last 30 days. So it's going to keep it sort of clean anyway, but still, there's a reason why sometimes you might want them to be able to do that, or maybe you want to disallow that. Maybe you want to put a hurdle in their way. That's fine. Now, most of the next options here are all about you as a manager when you're processing content in. There's an option here to disable the automatic preview generation that the Nexus CMS tries to do. If you do this, if you disable the automatic preview generation, then previews will be exactly the preview that you see in Windows. If you go to Windows and you show large icons for a file, that will be the preview, 100%. Or if you're loading something out of a project or out of an AutoCAD drawing, whatever the preview is that you see, like in the block editor or in Revit natively, in sort of the type dialog box, that will be the preview. And so it's going to disable auto generation of anything other than what's just sort of already kind of currently stored. Now we're going to talk in detail about preview generation when it's turned on in a future session from the CMS, and you can control a lot of things about how previews automatically get generated. But if this is checked, then none of that does anything for you because you've disabled it completely. So I like to leave it on. I love leveraging my automatic preview generation. You might like that as well. So if you want to leverage that, leave this unchecked. Don't disable it. Below that is use existing preview. So if you check this, then when content already exists in the CMS, it will already have some kind of a preview. Something will be showing. And if you check this option, use existing preview, then even if you're generating a preview, that preview won't replace what's already in Nexus if it discovers that content is already there, okay? So if you uncheck this, then every time you process content in, even if content already exists, then this preview will be refreshed. So if you're drastically changing your content as you process that new content in, that preview should be representative of that new content. So when might you want to use something like use existing preview and have that checked? Well, if you are intentionally within the CMS over here as BIM managers, telling it, I have to go to my own personal library here. So I use my library, and maybe I'll pick my own Revit content as an example here. Looking at my content, if I right-click something and I assign custom preview images, if I do this regularly and I'm very specifically choosing preview images that are not auto-generated in any form or fashion, then I probably, after I've gone through and made that effort, I probably don't want those to be replaced. And so I might choose then, in that case, to use existing previews. But that's your choice. You get to decide how you want that to work. In my case, I always like my preview images being refreshed, so I don't use this personally. The next option here is specific to AutoCAD users. AutoCAD has this lovely bit of functionality when a user goes to insert a block into the active drawing or to load something into the active drawing. As it loads, if the source of that content is not in the support file search paths of AutoCAD, it will pop a security dialog saying this is not necessarily safe content. That can be really frustrating for end users when they're loading in content. So the suppress security dialog on AutoCAD content loading, what that does is it takes this content cache location and it adds it to whatever their active profile is in AutoCAD. it does that before trying to load the content in and make sure that this path exists there. And if path exists there, then when the block tries to load from that cache location, from that local cache, then that security dialog no longer displays. I would recommend turning this on, because if content is coming from the Nexus CMS, that means you put it there, most likely. And if that's the case, it's, I'll air quote this, even though you can't see me, it's quote safe content, right? So this little informational thing over here basically tells you that that's what the Nexus CMS is doing, is it's adding that support file search path. The next checkbox down, again, while processing content into the CMS, you can enable resource management for Revit content. This specifically right now affects materials, Revit materials. Resources are really powerful. Materials in Revit are really powerful, but the big downfall of materials in Revit, and any of Autodesk's products for that matter, is that they depend on outside files that have to be available to the end user. It requires things like image texture files and bump maps and hue files, these extra JPEGs and PNGs. And if they don't exist, the graphic representation of those materials is rubbish. It uses default stuff and it's not the material you thought you were getting. So by enabling resource management for Revit content, when you, the admin, process material-based content into the Nexus CMS, those extra files that those materials depend on, they get processed in as well. And you've got some extra settings. We'll take a look at that in the future when we're actually processing content, but this will enable that functionality in the first place. We're going to review this particular setting when we get there to make sure that it's turned on when we're doing that. This also means if you process in a main piece of content like a door or a window or a wall, and those things have materials associated to them, then the Nexus CMS is going to look for those materials and subsequently look for those material dependencies and make sure that they're all available. So when a user goes and grabs a door, then that door also gets its materials, and those materials also get their content. That's the material resources. And then the final option here is specific to, again, Revit content. Do you want to enable automatic upgrading for Revit content? So say you, the BIM manager, decide I process in a Revit 2022 piece of content. Do I want that automatically upgraded to 23, 24, 25? And in the future, when it comes out, 26. If you have this turned on, then it will enable that. Now, it does not retroactively go back through all of your previously processed in content and start to trigger that auto upgrade. This triggers and sets a flag on your content at the time you process it to say, does this content auto upgrade? And it will trigger at that point. So if you have existing content in the Nexus CMS, great, reprocess some of that content. And when you reprocess it right now with this option turned on, that content will begin to automatically then upgrade, and you'll start seeing that content manifest in multiple Revit versions with no extra effort by you after that initial processing with this flag set. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about one final thing. When you're configuring all of these settings, you do need to save those settings. So here in the portal, you saw me do this with the user settings. I made a bunch of changes and then I clicked save. Now in here, I haven't done any saves yet. I've made some changes. I've checked and unchecked some boxes, and I don't remember if I made anything that changed that I didn't want to have changed, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to click save here. When you click save, it'll refresh the page and those settings will be locked in. Okay, so that is important. You must save your settings. If you just check some boxes and navigate away from this page, those settings have not saved. And when you come back to the organization settings, they will be back to whatever their previous value was. It's going to refresh the page. So check your options, set everything up the way that you want it, and click save. And that will lock these settings in so that when you're opening up the CMS and you're doing work within the Nexus environment, that these settings all take effect. Okay. With that, for those of you watching this as a webinar, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you. We always appreciate when you take a look at our YouTube channel. We hope that this information is good and valuable for you, and that enough so that maybe you subscribe and like it, right? Give us a whole bump on the YouTube's environment.